Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Dr. Alex Auerbach. Alex, how are you?
Dan, I am great. Thank you for having me back on the show. It's always fun to spend some time with you, and it's an honor to be here.
No, well, it's an honor to be joined by you. I always love learning from you and always enjoy looking down your X timeline with all your fantastic tweets. There's really some insightful stuff there, and I think you've probably brought all of that wisdom together and written your first book, and we're going to unpack that today. So I'm really excited. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Sure. So I am a counseling and performance psychologist by training. So I have a PhD in counseling psychology with basically a double major in sport and performance psychology, and have spent the last 10 years working with high performers across spaces. My main gig, if you will, was as the sports psychologist for the NBA's Toronto Raptors for several years, where I was involved in everything we did as an organization, from selecting players to trading players to working directly with players to working with coaches, working with staff, helping hire a head coach, all sorts of fun stuff. And since that time, I've become more of a consultant of sorts. So I'm working with a WNBA team right now, going through some of that process. I've done a bit of work with Army Special Forces on things like live demolition training and jumping out of planes and defusing live bombs, which has been a lot of fun, and worked a fair bit with collegiate and Olympic athletes as well. So that's a bit about me in a nutshell. Before I became a psychologist, I was an American football coach in a former life too. So I've got a little bit of a different lens, I think, when it comes to sports psychology, and in particular working with coaches, and have tried my best, as you mentioned in this book, to sort of synthesize some of the things I think I know as I get into this next phase of my career.
I think last time you were on, we spoke a lot about that former career as an American football coach and how it's impacted your psychological practice. Intrigued to hear that you've gone into the Army and done some work with them, the US Army, jumping out of planes. Did you actually jump out of a plane? And if you did you use all of your techniques on yourself to enable you to do that?
Thank goodness I did not have to jump out of
Okay.
any planes, but I spent some time with a unit that their kind of primary role is to be flown into an area and diffuse improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. And so, as you can imagine, these young men and women are between 18 and 25 or 26 years old, and have to do something incredibly nerve wracking and then calm down enough to figure out how to actually diffuse something like that, which is just requires a level of concentration and self regulation and stress management and all sorts of mental skills that, quite frankly, probably exceed anything that would go on in professional sports, just from the actual consequences on the line. But it's an incredible group to spend some time with. Both because this from working with some of the world's best performers too. Like when you spend time with people like that at the cutting edge of what they're doing, the intensity that they bring to their performance and to their craft is really, it's like something to marvel at. And so it's a very special group to spend some time with.
Knowing what I know from the language that we tend to use in sports psychology, we talk a lot about focusing on the process. And perhaps some of us speak to the idea of letting performance take care of itself, and certainly letting the outcomes take care of themselves, not being too outcome oriented or ego oriented. We might use that kind of language, but it feels like that environment there, it's kind of important to consider the outcome, because the outcome could be death, as opposed to in sport where, hey, it feels, having been a pro golfer, it feels pretty bad when you play badly, but there's not that imminent threat of death. Did you feel as you joined those troops, did you feel that the psychological techniques, the mental skills that you use on a day-to-day basis with sports competitors really translated well into that field?
I did. And I think for me, a lot of the fundamentals sort of stick around, right? And a lot of what I've written about, I think, is pertinent. There's still a need to, control your arousal, direct your attention, use good cognitive strategies to figure out how to navigate whatever's going on in your head, right? Whether that might be unhelpful self-talk or really extreme nervousness, right? All things that might disrupt kind of peak performance. And so in many ways, I think the focus on the process is still right. I think what I found to be different is sort of the sanctity around what it is you're doing, and kind of honoring the fact that like there are just different levels of consequences here. It doesn't mean that we should be thinking about the outcome or be hyper focused on that, because again, I think like anything that would disrupt performance. But I've always believed the outcomes matter, even though it sounds good to say focus on the process and don't worry about the outcomes. And I think that's sort of right for getting your headspace right, if you will. But I think to pretend that the outcomes aren't important or somehow will just show up on their own by only focusing on the process, I think is a tad misguided. And I also think that, in really extreme outcome kind of situations like this, or even, incredibly extreme sports, right, where you have people doing big wave surfing or other things like that, I think there's a different level of appreciating the potential consequences and at least recognizing the possibility there, honoring that without letting that overtake you. But avoiding it, as you know, has its own consequences, right? So you've got to balance that.
Alex, we're here to talk today about your new book, Called to Greatness, your personal playbook for the pursuit of excellence. And, first things first, many congratulations on this. Absolutely fantastic. I've loved going through it. As always, learned a lot from you, and we'll definitely shamelessly steal some of your ideas from this book. But I'm looking forward to diving in and, letting our audience understand a little bit about your thoughts and your work here. Tell us a bit about the genesis of the book. What sowed the seeds of writing this particular book?
There are really two kind of big things that came up for me that sort of spurred on the writing of the book. The first was my experience as part of the NBA draft with the fourth overall pick back in 2021. And the idea was, we're about to draft a franchise changing player at four overall. We don't know who it's going to be, but whoever it is, we better get it right. Like half of it is making the right pick, and then half of it is figuring out, once they're in your ecosystem, what is it that you need to do around them for them to be successful. And so I went on a bit of a search, right, to figure out like what should I be doing? What is the actual best way to take this, at the time, $40-ish million investment, which has now become a several $100 million investment, and make sure that this player has the tools that they need to be successful. And I was really discouraged by what I found, because there wasn't anything that was comprehensive enough to sort of speak to all the different things that would go into actually helping this player succeed throughout the course of an 82 game season. And I think people have done some great work in this space, but I felt like it was a little bit sort of siloed in the way that it's been put together, right? There's people have their lines of thinking in the research or the stuff that they're very interested in. And of course they get really deep in that area. And so there's a ton of value there, but they don't always link that to, say, another process or principle that might be just as important, right? And so I started to think about, what would a comprehensive plan look like for someone like this? And I don't know how you felt about this, but I know for me, when I've looked at the sports psych research in particular, there's sort of like two broad paths, right? There's the mental health angle, which is obviously very important. And then there's the peak performance angle, which I think is also important. But the peak performance angle tackles a lot of like what to do, when the game's on the line or in big moments, but not really like, how do you function when you go to practice, or what does it look like on the day to day to be great? And the mental health angle talks a lot about wellness and well-being, but really doesn't overlap much and talk about how this leads to peak performance. So this first experience was sort of like, okay, I better put together some plan that I feel good about, that's science backed, that gives me some insight into a formula I can follow, because that's what everybody else is doing around this young man, right? Like sports medicine has a plan for how they're going to take him from draft day to put on muscle and sort of progress him to becoming a great player, right? And I needed to feel like I had a plan to do the same thing. So that was sort of the first experience. And coupled with that was, as I was thinking about that, was sort of like, man, it's kind of sad that like there isn't really anything out here like this. There's nothing that exists. I went back to my graduate school reading list from my doctoral advisor and found nothing that was sort of like speaking to me. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe this could be the book that I wish I would have had in graduate school. And there's definitely some other books out there that I think, speak to some of peak performance and have some great ideas in there that I do draw on and like a lot. But I felt like this would be sort of a bridge there. So that was the genesis of the book, was sort of like write the book I wish I had in graduate school, plus write the book I feel like I need to actually do a good job taking this young man from fourth overall to NBA All-Star.
A meshing of the peak performance side of things with the mental health side of things. How have you structured this book? When somebody opens the book, what are they confronted with?
The first thing you're going to find is that I've broken the book into two parts and defined two different types of performance. And this was actually a concept I stumbled on in the research while I was doing some of this, was this sort of differentiating between typical performance and peak performance. And honestly, like, it wasn't something I had ever heard before I started reading about it. And I was like, man, this makes so much sense, right? Typical performance is how do you show up on a day-to-day basis and do your best, right? But if you're an NBA player, let's say, like, that's a practice day, right? Or that's shoot around. That's not game time. And that is different, right? How you figure out how you maximize practice or maximize the days between games does have a material impact on what happens on game day. So you definitely can't, slack off and do nothing on those days, right? You need some kind of framework for progressively getting better at your typical performance and doing what I would call like raising your baseline, right? Making yourself better and better over time, so that as you get into competition, the leap to peak performance isn't so high and you have some skills that you can deploy that sort of get you into that place. So that's part one, is all about this sort of building your foundation and baseline for a strong typical performance. And if you think about life outside of sports, this is, if you're the CEO, right, this is your showing up to work on a day-to-day basis and running your meetings and being a good leader. And then the part two is about peak performance, which is what I think most of us think about when we think about sports psych, right? It's, how you perform under the biggest pressure and brightest lights, 2 minutes to go in an NBA game. Like, what are the things you need to be doing to win? And of course, those skills are also really interesting and really useful. But peak performance doesn't happen all the time, right? And you're not always going to have an opportunity to even play. Like, if you're an NBA player, sometimes you're going to sit games out, right? And so you've got to know how to sort of get yourself into the zone and into high performance when you do get your opportunity. And that's what part two is about. And so again, to finish the CEO thread, right? It's your big board meeting or your pitch for an investment or something like that. These moments that have an outsized importance in the outcomes you're working toward, that do require a different set of skills to really deliver. And so I tried to separate the book into sort of longer term baseline foundational development things in the typical performance section, and then a small subset of skills in the peak performance section, so that people could actually apply what they learn here.
So those reading the book who aren't either professional athletes or developing professional athletes or developing elite level athletes, and day to day they are in the workplace, they can take some of these ideas and utilize them in their work environment.
That's the idea. I tried to write something that would be as universal as I could make it, right? I am a person who believes that regardless of what your performance is, whether it's sports or running a business or even something like parenting, there are still a small subset of foundational principles that'll matter for doing a great job at that. And I wanted to give people basically a sequence of steps they could follow, much like this fourth overall pick in the draft, to help themselves consistently be better at whatever it is that they care about.
I love that. Let's unpack part one, the qualities of typical performance. Let's go through each quality and give us some nuggets from each chapter, from each quality. So chapter one, quality one, adaptation. Talk to me a little bit about adaptation, Alex.
So quality one is built on this principle of what's called adaptive capacity, right? It's basically your ability to take on progressively higher, harder challenges. And so if you think about the concept of adaptive capacity, it really boils down to this simple idea of, progressively more hard things. So stress, right? Plus a bit of recovery, right? And what you get is growth in some way, shape, or form, right? So to draw a physical parallel, right? You go to the gym, you stress your muscles, you take a day or two off, you come back, you're a little bit stronger. The same thing is sort of true from a mental perspective, right? You put yourself in challenging situations, You work through it, you process, you reflect, you rest, and then you come back with a slightly greater skill set for handling something a bit more challenging in the long term. And so I chose to start here because I think this is, for me, the foundation of what it means to progressively get better and better. Like, people talk about getting 1% better all the time. And if you get 1% better every day, you're 37 times better at the end of the year. And like, look, that all sounds great. So how do you actually do that? Right. That's a nice thought. What does it mean to get 1% better? And to me, getting 1% better is finding a place where you can stress yourself or challenge yourself a little bit more than you did yesterday, taking the time to rest and reflect on that, synthesizing what you've learned, and iterating and going through it again. And so I unpack in this chapter essentially the different facets of adaptive capacity that you'll need to be successful. So I start with kind of a foundation of well-being. I talk about skills that I think both of us would agree are pretty important for long-term performance. And they're not super flashy, right? But they're still foundational nonetheless, right? It's things like sleep or getting your nutrition right. Talking a little bit about like hydration, even relationships, like just again, the foundational elements of being able to manage stress and take on progressively higher, harder challenges. You need these things if you're going to do that well. And I think sleep is probably the best example, right? If you deprive yourself of sleep, or you have two small children like me and you don't sleep super well at night anymore right now, your ability to manage stress is going to be a bit depleted, right? And so sleep just does become really important for whether you're an NBA player or an executive leader. Being able to manage your emotions, your thinking, recover from whatever stress that you've got going on. And then from there, you can see how all these other things connect, right? Like relationships are such a big part of rest and recovery, and social support, for example, is the best predictor we have of resilience and things like that. So I'm happy to get into any of these sort of subsets here. But that was sort of the idea behind chapter one.
Um, I'm probably not going to formulate a question, just in a nod of agreement back at you, in as much as what I love about what you've done here in chapter one is help people to make sense of the link between this notion of fundamentals, as you said, like diet, nutrition, sleep, rest. Um, make sense of the link between those principles, those fundamentals, and subsequently your capacity to engage in stress that is then going to lead to some growth. I'm not too sure very many people kind of make sense and connect those together. And I think that's an absolutely crucial connection, Alex.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I worked hard to figure out how to draw that connection for people, so I'm glad it resonates, and I think that's exactly right. I think oftentimes we sort of think of these fundamentals as like you either have them or you don't, and if they're there, you just kind of take it for granted, and it has no bearing really on like what goes on next. We sort of like minimize these things, and it's like, oh, it's all about mindset, or it's all about did you practice hard enough? And it's like, look, that stuff matters too. But if you practice really hard and you eat like crap, it's still going to be bad, Or if you practice really hard and you don't sleep, right, your capacity is going to be diminished in some way. You're not going to maximize what's possible here. And so I think that's a great call out, because I do think, honestly, I think getting these fundamentals right is a huge part of being able to sustain excellence over, say, the course of an 82 game NBA season, or several years of running a company or raising your kids. And if you don't take these seriously and you don't sort of unpack how each of these things do or do not help you, you're leaving an opportunity to get better on the table. And ultimately, that's what I believe this is all about, is figuring out how you become the best version of yourself. And each of these things are, of course, part and parcel of that.
It feels seamless that would move into chapter two, quality two, mental strength. There seems like a strong link between those first two chapters.
I think that's right. I mean, the the short version of it would be, I think your strength is diminished if your capacity is low, right? So, the more that you can build your adaptive capacity, the more quote unquote mentally strong you might be. And of course, this was a tough chapter to sort of think about, right? There's like the ideas of mental toughness, and people like mental strength, and so I'm like wrestling with sort of how do I frame this for people, but ultimately landed on kind of like borrowing the sort of physical fitness kind of parallel here, because I think there are interesting ways of thinking about how mental fitness or mental performance mirrors kind of physical performance, right? And so the way I think about mental strength, or in the beginning I open with a quote about mental toughness, but it's just this idea of really being able to sort of like stay confident, feel like you can deliver, overcome your fears, and a lot of that is built on your progressive experience building your adaptive capacity, right? And seeing those yourself, overcome higher, harder challenges builds confidence, right? Builds that sense of self-belief, builds this idea that you're going to be able to reach your goals, deliver at the highest level. And I think that you need that if you're then going to persist at anything, right? If you're ultimately going to become good at whatever it is that you do, you need a little bit of fortitude. So you need to believe that you're going to be able to deliver it. You need to believe you can reach your goals. You need to believe in yourself, that has to be built on a foundation of past success. Otherwise, it's all smoke and mirrors.
Fortitude, persistence, belief, are these the qualities of mental strength?
Yeah, I mean, the way I tried to break it down in the book was really around sort of different subsets of self belief, ultimately, is what I boiled mental strength down to. So, fortitude, I think, is kind of an example of that. But I really tried to break down the science of confidence, right? So, I looked at things like self efficacy, right? And you and I would both be familiar with that. But essentially, like, do you believe that you can deliver on a specific task in a specific situation? Not this kind of global confidence that people often feel like they need to be successful. And then I tried to break into different types of self belief that I think help people perform consistently well. So the first is this belief in your ability to reach your goals. And the idea here is, you've talked a lot about desirable difficulty and this idea that things need to be sort of at this 85% sweet spot, right? Where there's a good chance that you can succeed, but a small chance that you'll fail. Well, to even set that kind of goal, you need to believe that you can reach it, right? And that you've got the tools to sort of be successful. And so I think having that belief in your ability to reach your goals and to be successful, yeah, I think is pretty critical to this idea of mental strength and your ability to, again, persist or overcome your fears or keep working on something that's important to you. And in this chapter, I also break down, we talked about the process earlier. So I break down kind of process goals, performance goals, and outcome goals. So you can sort of see what kinds of goals you need to believe in and how they layer into each other. And then I talk about, I found this really cool line of research around sporting genius. And the idea in here is that you need a little bit of creativity and risk taking and this sort of belief that you're unstoppable to reach the highest levels of whatever it is that you do. But I actually think that that's a foundational skill set, right? I don't think this belief is something you can call upon, like say in Wimbledon. I think you need to be building this belief before you get to Wimbledon for that to actually be impactful. And that's why this belief shows up here in chapter 2. And so the second belief I list out is the belief in your qualities that make you unstoppable. And I believe that everyone has something special about them, a signature strength or set of skills that they can uniquely deliver. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't also work hard. I know we can talk forever about growth mindset and fixed mindset, right? So I have to be careful about that. But it is this sort of idea that I think the best performers in the world do recognize they have something really special about them and they work really diligently at enhancing whatever that signature skill is for them to reach their full potential. And so I think of a guy like Steph Curry, for example, who recognized fairly early that he could become one of the greatest NBA shooters of all time. It doesn't mean he didn't work on anything else, but it means part of what has allowed him to sustain his excellence over time is this consistent development of his shooting ability and this belief that he can deliver in that specific role. And then I talk a little bit in the chapter about self-control. And, a lot of this research comes from the marshmallow test and Walter Michel's research, but around this idea of being able to sort of delay gratification, persist and push yourself to do something that's a little bit harder, recognizing the rewards that will come down the line. And again, I think that is a function of believing that you can do it, right? You're not going to engage in self-control if you don't believe there's anything for you on the other side. And so you've got to sort of pair these things together for you to be maximally successful. And then I close the chapter with this idea of this sort of inner drive to succeed, right? You might call it like passion, harmonious passion, right? But you really have to want it. And I know that sounds a little bit trite, but I think the foundation of mental strength is this sort of obsessiveness in a good way, a healthy way, about what it is that you're working toward. And again, that's built on this foundation of believing you can actually succeed and having some evidence of that, so that you can sort of layer in this insatiable will to get it done. And I think if you pair those together, you get your mental strength.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, Alex. And the word that emanates as you're speaking to me is optimism, rightly or wrongly. I mean, the that quality of optimism as a consequence of believing that you can reach your goals, setting those big goals, as you say, goals that perhaps that you'll find stressful and tough to achieve, but you believe you can reach them. And the other thing that comes to mind as you're speaking is that link between, and I'm going to be sound a little bit geekish here, but that link between self-efficacy and motivation. I think it is a truism to suggest that if you don't experience high self-efficacy, then it's very possible that your motivation is going to drop. Because if you don't believe that you've got the skills to achieve in a specific task or a specific activity or game, then over time, your will to commit to any kind of improvement process is probably going to diminish. And then just towards the end there, just mentioning it was researcher Valeron's idea of harmonious passion. I love the fact that you've dived into that as well. So optimism, motivation, harmonious passion, just absolutely fascinating stuff, mate.
Well, thank you. And you're jumping into chapter 3. You're there already. I try to draw some of
Getting ahead of
these
myself.
same links for you. And you actually, I talk in chapter 3 about motivation intensity theory, which is sort of this idea you're mentioning. Like, if you don't believe that you can do it, or you don't want it bad enough, you're not really going to persist and stay motivated. We talk a lot, obviously, about intrinsic motivation, and I think that's fine and good. But there's also some, some of it you just have to believe you can do it, and it has to matter to you. Otherwise, the intrinsic motivation is not going to matter so much. But anyway, we can get into chapter 3 when you're ready.
Let's do so now. Dive in. Perfect segue.
Yeah. So, I mean, chapter 3 is all about endurance, right? And I think for me, the way I thought about this is endurance in sort of two timescales, right? The first is getting through a specific season. You've been around high level sports, so I know you've heard this phrase, but it's a marathon and a sprint, right? And everyone's sprinting all the time. And you're like, well, let's just like figure out how we do a measured sprint then. You're not going to be able to always go 100% for all 82 games of an NBA season. You're certainly not going to feel 100% every single game over the course of your 15-year career, right? And so you've got to have some level of willingness to endure, essentially, difficulties, ups and downs, waxing and waning of your success, for you to sort of continuously make progress on this quest to get 1% better. And so chapter 3 is really about the building blocks of like psychological endurance. How do you sort of keep yourself persisting? And so you hit on some qualities. I labeled them a little bit differently, but I think optimism would for sure fit in here. So I talked about in this chapter kind of grit, resilience, motivation, and purpose. So grit, I break down into the traditional Duckworth framework, right? Passion and perseverance for long-term goals, and talk a little bit about harmonious passion versus obsessive passion. And for me, this is sort of the foundation of endurance. People talk about loving the game as really critical. I think this is really what they mean when they talk about loving the game, is sort of being appropriately obsessed with becoming the best version of yourself in the context of whatever it is that you're working on. And so I think that's a foundational element. And I think to do that well, you also have to have a bit of a hard-headedness about you, a persistence, and a willingness to sort of push to where people think is a little bit unreasonable. I don't really know any all-time great performer or even elite performer who's not a bit unreasonable. And I think that that's good. Not, being unreasonable for the sake of being unreasonable alone, but for believing that if they kind of keep working at it and keep hammering away, they're going to be able to achieve something, and they kind of see it before even sometimes other people see it. And so I talk about how those two things fit together here to sort of form a foundation of being willing to persist over the long term. I talk about resilience because obviously no journey to greatness is without its fair share of setbacks, and so draw on some of the research from guys like Mustafa Sarkar, who have done an incredible deep dive and unpacking of what actually helps people respond well to adversity. So I talk in here about one of my favorite concepts, kind of the challenge mindset and managing stress effectively and seeing stress as enhancing as sort of foundational elements for being willing to persist and overcome the stressors that you have. I talk about motivation. So we've talked a little bit about motivation intensity and sort of just the baseline of wanting to be successful as sort of a critical factor for being willing to engage in any kind of goal directed pursuit. Like you have to believe that you can do it and it has to actually matter to you. And then we can talk about intrinsic motivation, right? And feeling really rewarded, connected, like you have autonomy, like you're making progress, right? Like all those things are obviously very important, but they're only important in the context of something you actually want to be successful at. And so I think sometimes we talk about intrinsic motivation like it's this sort of like the only thing that matters for being great over the long term. And like if you just focus on becoming intrinsically motivated, everything will be fine. That's first of all, we know that we need a little bit of extrinsic motivation to sustain success over the long term. So it can't all be intrinsic. And we also have to have a couple other elements here for this to really be successful. And so the final element is purpose, right? And the way I talk about purpose in here is really the ability to make meaning and make sense of what it is that you're going through and sort of be able to link that back to the passion that you experience on the front end. So passion kind of drives you forward. Purpose is sort of this reflective process where you're constantly staying connected to what matters most to you, and you're using that as fuel for showing up the next day.
You mentioned there Dr. Mr. Fasaka, who's been on Sports Psych Show quite a few times now, and it makes me think of his framework, as you kind of alluded to there, high challenge and high support, which I always really, really love. And just, thinking about that continuum of motivation from extrinsic to intrinsic, and obviously it makes us think of self-determination theory, DC and Orion. And I don't know if you agree with me, Alex. I always think of if we can have as many drivers and rewards as possible, as many extrinsic and intrinsic drivers and rewards as possible, at least those that are, as you mentioned, are relevant and meaningful to us, that gives us a greater chance to retain that sense of motivation day by day, week by week, month by month, season by season. Our careers slip by. As you say, I think an exacting look across that continuum is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, as I dug into the research there, like, and I don't know, you're familiar with kind of like the introjected motivation concept, but this idea that it's sort of like central to your identity and you don't want to let that down or disappoint this sort of core part of who you are. Like, I think that also fuels some of this greatness. And so I think you're exactly right. You need to look at the full kind of intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation continuum and really figure out what levers you pull at any given point in that continuum to help yourself. And everyone's sort of like, formula is going to be a little bit different, right? What moves you might be a little different from what moves me. But to say it's all going to be intrinsic, I think is actually a recipe for ultimately burnout and some unhealthy kind of obsession, right? Because you end up sort of only focusing on the internal and not so much seeing any benefit outside. And I think we just all need that. We all need a little bit of pats on the back or monetary rewards or whatever it might be to keep going. And so I think finding that balance is exactly right.
I love what you're saying there, and it reminds me of an episode going back about 7 or 8 years to one of the very first Sports Psych Show episodes, a wonderful episode with Lara Mossman, who took us through self-determination theory, and she talks about flavors of motivation, which I for me, you're reminding me of that there. Moving on to chapter 4, which unpacks quality 4, which is flexibility, which is definitely something I'm thinking about every single day with my clients. Talk us through how you approach this idea of flexibility.
Well, first of all, I'm just impressed that you can remember a podcast from 7 or 8 years ago. Like, I'm having a hard
Just a
time
very sad
remembering.
man, mate.
I'm having a hard time remembering what I had for breakfast yesterday. So the fact that you're pulling this out, you're putting me to shame a little bit.
Not at all.
The foundation of chapter 4 is really the concept of psychological flexibility from the acceptance and commitment therapy school of thought. And again, in my research, as I'm looking at how do I figure out creating and supporting this, incredibly talented player that we drafted, I stumbled upon this great paper called Psychological Flexibility as a Fundamental Aspect of Health. It's an epic paper. It's like 50 something pages long. There's a huge summary of all these different outcomes related to psychological flexibility. But what they found was essentially that this quality, this sort of matrix of skills that underpin psychological flexibility leads to better mental health, better physical health, better ability to manage stress, better work-life integration, more healthy goal pursuit. And I'm like, Holy cow. And I was trained pretty deeply in acceptance and commitment therapy in graduate school. So I already had a little bit of a bias to sort of think about things this way. Um, but then seeing that, I'm like, man, this is too important to not account for in what we're doing here. And so, chapter 4 is really an unpacking of the 6 psychological processes that underpin psychological flexibility from acceptance and commitment therapy. And the simplest way to sort of frame it for the audience, right, is it's your ability to be present, your ability to engage with your values, and your ability to essentially accept or manage your thinking and feeling in a way that facilitates the pursuit of your goals and values. And so oftentimes when I think about peak performance, just as or high performance broadly, it's a very simplistic view for a minute here, but bear with me, is like a lot of it is just identifying internal obstacles that block you from getting toward what you really care about. At its core, that's what I think a lot of what we do is. And we all have different tools or techniques we leverage to help people manage whatever these internal obstacles are. And this just happens to be a framework I really like for managing those internal obstacles, because it helps you clarify your values and what it is that you're working toward long term. It allows you to connect your goals to those values and your behaviors to those goals, to those values. So you form this really nice link between what you're doing today and who you want to become in the future. And then it provides you with a set of skills that facilitate overcoming whatever internal obstacles you might face in pursuit of those goals and values. And so I think kind of the way that this chapter is framed is really kind of around 4 internal obstacles, right? The first is thinking, right? It's your unhelpful self-talk. It's your, you know, critical self-beliefs, right? Or negative schemas, whatever language you want to use, right? It's the thought that you're not good enough or that you don't know what you're doing. It's imposter syndrome. It's all these things, right? The second is difficult emotions, right? It's feeling nervous and backing out, right? Or thinking about avoidance as a core process. And when the pressure gets too high, you sort of quit because it's easier to run away and avoid the discomfort than it is to find ways to manage it, right? And so that's, again, another internal obstacle that I think people have to deal with to be able to perform effectively. Then there's the ability to be present, right? So I think, again, one of the obstacles that inhibits high performance and sustained excellence is thinking about the past or thinking about the future. Our brains are really good at this, as you know, right? I think the data says somewhere like 48% of our thoughts are in the past or future, which is an absurd amount of time to not be here. And so the more that you can sort of figure out how to be present, be in the moment where performance is happening, I think the better you can be. But I think oftentimes thoughts about the past or the future are really ultimately distractions that sort of inhibit your ability to deliver, whether it's a regular performance, typical performance, or a peak performance. And then finally, there's an element of identity here, right? And I know I talked about identity and introduction motivation. I do think identity really matters. And I think of identity as something that is quite important for being a high performer. Like, I do think you need to see yourself that way if you ultimately want to be great at what it is that you do. But we don't want to hold on to it so tightly that we sort of live and die with every outcome, which is honestly quite common, particularly for young NBA players, let's say, right? To come in and all they've known is basketball, and they've really built their sense of self-worth around being a great basketball player. And for many of them, they've been the best player on their team until they get to the NBA. And then you're like the 10th best player on the team. And now all of a sudden, everything that you believe about yourself and how great you are is sort of like thrust into question, right? And you really have to examine that. And I think that, again, is an internal obstacle that you have to figure out how to overcome. And so the processes in chapter 4 are giving you the tools to manage those kinds of obstacles.
Well, if you're impressed that I can remember a random podcast from 7 or 8 years ago, I'm impressed with your deep dives into Google Scholar or whatever resources that you've been using and finding these fantastic, if slightly obscure research papers that you can use for your book. But, look, we've had quite a few episodes dedicated to ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. And whilst I absolutely love so many different frameworks, including REBT, rational emotive behavior therapy, which might seem like the converse of ACT, I do actually think they could potentially be used hand in hand. But the point being, I've definitely grown in interest with acceptance commitment therapy. I just think there's to speak to your last point there, there's some wonderful tools in this approach, ACT, that can help people to diffuse from their internal distractors, if you like, to use a similar term to what you've been using, to be able to execute actions and behaviors in a certain way, irrespective of the thoughts, emotions, feelings that we're having. I mean, that flexibility is absolutely critical, isn't it, Alex?
It is, and it's funny that you mention REBT and some kind of schools of thought that people I think at once viewed as sort of antithetical that I think actually do fit quite neatly together. And ultimately, the way I think about flexibility is it's just a set of skills or tools you can use. And so REBT skills or tools would also fit with a flexible mindset, right? Like if you know whatever skill works for you in a specific situation, that's okay. And sometimes you're going to have the time to do the challenging of your own automatic negative thoughts and look for evidence and all these things that are sort of core to traditional cognitive behavior therapy. And sometimes you're going to have to just let it go because you don't have enough time, right? And so knowing how to do both, I think, is going to be useful. And just to go on sort of a brief tangent about obscure research for a second, I don't know how much you've sort of read and followed the sort of evolution of ACT, but there's this whole kind of new school of thought around process-based behavior therapy. And I think for me, ultimately as a practitioner, that's really where I find myself gravitating because I think ultimately if we can find sort of a core set of, I think there's 21 kind of evidence-based principles that we can deploy at any time, having a nice framework like ACT is great. But just knowing whatever tool you can use and being able to draw several different options, I think is probably the most helpful thing we can do for the performers that we work with. And so, to your point, there's some kind of core REBT principles that show up in that work, and they've done a great job fitting something like challenging core beliefs with diffusion, let's say, right? So there's this sort of like either path works. Let's figure out what works for you.
I think you've given me my next deep dive. Process-based behavior therapy, absolutely fantastic.
Glad.
Complete part one for us by taking us through chapter 5, quality 5, self-regulation.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I wrote the book, this was originally chapter 1. And then after a fair bit of editing and restructuring, as I know goes on in the process.
That sounds like my process of writing.
Yeah.
The last chapter becomes the first chapter, and the middle
Yeah,
chapter goes completely, all that kind of stuff.
Actually, well, it's funny enough. Actually, what ended up being part 2 of the book was originally part 1 of the book. So
Right,
you
yeah.
can
Oh,
see
it always flows.
how it all moves around. But ultimately, this chapter is the bridge between the two, right? It's so self regulation. I broke it down really into two parts. The first is broadly the ability to sort of manage, control, direct your thinking, feeling, physiology, and behavior, right? Essentially, the ability to like control yourself and persistently work in pursuit of your goals, right? So all the skills I cover before chapter 5 are all part of this sort of puzzle of self-regulation. And then I introduce some other tools and tactics that you can use here, right? So things like breath work. I talk about things like broadening out your repertoire of behaviors. I talk about getting feedback and learning from yourself. But ultimately, I think you've got to be able to first regulate your nervous system in some way. Second, direct your attention in some way. Third, deploy some strategies to make your mind work for you effectively, what we would call cognitive strategies, right? So this first part of self-regulation is about those 3 steps, right? Can I get my nervous system under control consistently, sort of be what I would call poised, right? So it's not necessarily calm or relaxed, but it's also not too jacked up. It's kind of like in the zone of optimal functioning for you, right? Poised and under control. Second, can I put my attention where it needs to be, right? In the present on whatever task it is I'm doing. And then third, can I use whatever augmenting cognitive strategies like good self-talk or imagery or whatever it might be to facilitate the pursuit of my goals? The second part of this chapter is about self-regulated learning, which is a slightly different concept, but I had to find a creative way to lump them together here. And this is really the ability to plan and set goals, monitor and evaluate your progress, and adjust and iterate as you go. And I know you know this from the work that you've done in elite soccer, but this skill, this ability to take yourself through this self-regulated learning cycle underpins deliberate practice. It underpins the development of elite skill. And ultimately, I think is foundational from separating the best from the rest. And what I love about it is it requires that first part of self-regulation, right? Like you've got to be poised, you've got to be present, you've got to know what you're up to. And then if you layer those into this sort of cycle of self-regulated learning where you're working towards your goal, you're evaluating, you're iterating, you've got a really good formula for becoming pretty good at whatever it is that you're doing. And so I tried to sort of unpack that in this chapter here, with the idea being that if you can take yourself through this self-regulated learning cycle, you'll develop the elite skill that you need to ultimately get into part two, where you're going to perform at your peak. And so I talk a lot about some of the basics of self-regulated learning to close out part one. Because again, we know that this skill separates the best from the rest, and I love it because it's actually quite simple. But I think most of the things high performance are not all that sexy and actually pretty simple. Don't require like crazy ice baths or standing on your head for 30 seconds to let the blood rush to your head for you to become great at something kind of deal. I chose purposely to end with something simple that anyone could use to help themselves become better.
Well, you mentioned my work in soccer, and I think if someone was to ask me what's the difference that can make the difference for a young player trying to progress their career, an ambitious young competitor trying to progress their career in soccer, and this applies to any sport, I would probably say self-regulated learning, Alex. So I completely concur. Other sports psychs might have, a different answer, but I just think it's absolutely critical. I'd like to move on to part two, the principles of peak performance, and start to unpack this. This will be exciting to unpack. We move on with chapter 6, and this is principle number 1, preparation. A word used all the time by coaches and by sports psychologists, but how do you interpret preparation when it comes to peak performance?
So I broke preparation down into two parts. The first was physical preparation, and the second was psychological preparation. And to speak to kind of the second reason for creating the book, right? One of the things that I found, I don't know about you, Dan, because I think we trained in very different places, but in my graduate school training, I got essentially zero training in skill acquisition. Basically none. And it's like, this is such a core part of what I end up being asked about and spending my time on as a sports psychologist in the NBA. And so it was a very big gap to bridge from, basically a really deep amount of training and mental health work to, hey, how do we actually like help this player shoot threes better? And some of it was intuitive for me in that, like, you watch NBA players go out to practice and they shoot 3,000 uncontested threes from the same spot, just like clockwork. And you're like, okay, this is probably helpful to a point, but this definitely isn't the way we're going to get better at shooting threes with a hand in your face and 2 minutes to go in the game. Like, there's got to be some other ways that we could be preparing to get people ready. And so part one was like me learning about skill acquisition and figuring out how do you actually physically prepare for something. And so I broke that sort of subset of chapter 1 here, principle 1, into repetition, variation, and representativeness, right? So I talk about the times in which you should be just practicing a skill over and over again. And that's typically when you're trying to get the basics down, right? And just sort of get yourself up to a level of proficiency with delivering or executing on a specific skill. Then I talk about variation, which is essentially messing with some of the constraints under which you're executing this skill so you can learn different ways to do it. There's all sorts of, as you know, really fascinating research from ecological dynamics and all sorts of other places around how this plays out. But for the sake of the book, I tried to keep it very simple and just think about essentially how could you try this skill that you've just develop some competence in under different conditions so that you can see how it works for you. One of the examples I talk about a little bit in the book is a CEO I was working with where I had him practice his pitch under a bunch of different conditions. One was climbing up a mountain. One was in his grocery store. He actually chose that one on his own. He just grabbed the mic at a grocery store and gave his pitch until they kicked him out, kind of thing. I'm not suggesting you have to go to that level of extremes, but it is helpful to sort of execute the skill under different situations and see what holds up and then be able to refine. And then I talk about representativeness, which is essentially, can you practice this in conditions that as closely mimic the performance as possible, right? And so sports has obvious examples of scrimmages, right? Or preseason games that are essentially one giant block of representative practice. But I think oftentimes when we think of developing skill, most of the time we just think about repetition. And I at least think about my youth sports experience. That's where I spent most of my time, right? It was like, practicing the same thing over and over and over again and not really emphasizing these other two dimensions. And so the first element of principle one here is about having high quality practice, because I think ultimately without that, the rest of the stuff doesn't really matter. As much as I'm a mindset guy and a sports psychologist at heart, right? If you can't execute the skill, there's no amount of self-talk I'm going to give you that's going to help you deliver. Like if you can't shoot, you can't shoot, right? And we got to fix that first before we talk about the self-talk that you need to have when you're going out there and shooting, right? And then the second part of principle one is about good psychological preparation. And I would never claim to have the exact right formula for doing this. So I just shared what I thought has been helpful for the peak performers I work with. And so I talk a bit about pre-performance routines, imagery, goal setting, some of, again, the kind of very foundational, almost basic elements of peak performance, but things that I do think actually help people get ready to perform under high pressure moments. And so I walk you through how to create your own pre-performance routine, for example, or how you can set a goal for a particular performance or for a season, so that you can create a good context for pursuing your goals and sort of have all that preparation, physical preparation, be worth something.
Well, I love everything you said, and I love the fact that you haven't been shy about incorporating skill acquisition into this book. I think use that word shy. We can be far too shy in sports psychology to celebrate our contribution to skill acquisition, and so many great scientists in this area are also psychologists and function as sports psychologists. So I think we've got a great deal to add, and we can contribute in organizations and to governing bodies and with coaches and players themselves in this area. And we've had countless people on the Sports Psych show to talk about skill acquisition principles, like you've mentioned, such as representativeness, desirable difficulties, challenge point, and so on and so forth. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. Moving on to principle 2 in part 2, chapter 7, immersion. I love that word, immersion, but how have you treated immersion here?
The simplest way to explain it is like a very deep focus, right? That's sort of how I've treated immersion. It's a deep presence, and my belief is when you look at the world's best performers and people who are doing it, say in the NFL playoffs right now, they are fully in it. And I think everyone kind of knows what that feels like, right? People have used the word flow, for example, to describe what immersion might be. And I think that's really what this chapter is about. It's about being fully committed, being fully present, being all in on the performance. And so this chapter unpacks how do you actually do that? Again, gives you some simple tools you can deploy, things like mindfulness training to enhance your attention. We know that there's plenty of research that supports something as simple as 12 minutes a day for mindfulness training for 6 weeks, improving your ability to focus and pay attention. So I think there's a lot in this chapter about really getting into the moment and being present. And ultimately, again, I said this earlier, but for me, like peak performance happens here and now. You've got to be fully locked in and fully ready to go if you actually want to get the most out of yourself. And so I touch on some other kind of elements of this throughout the chapter that either help or hurt your ability to be fully immersed, right? So I talk about the idea of awareness and are you aware if you're here or not, right? And oftentimes, if you practice mindfulness, you'll catch yourself when you're drifting, right, or when you're not fully present, and can you redirect your focus and attention back where it needs to be? I talk about managing distraction. I know you're familiar with this too, but there's some great research that shows that for high level athletes like Olympic basketball players, the thing that most disrupts performance is distracting thoughts, right? And inhibits kind of clutch performance. And so it's like, how do you manage distractions? How do you stay focused, right? We all talk about things like controlling the controllables, and I think that that's good. What does that actually mean, right? And how do you focus your attention on what it is that you really can control? How do you guide your focus to where you need it to be to perform well, and stay attuned to whatever that is over the course of the game? And then the final thing I talk about that I think is sort of, I guess, unique in the way that I was thinking about immersion here was this idea of kind of going all in or being fully committed to the performance. And I think that this is something that we take for granted often when we send, say, 5 NBA players out onto the floor, but we all know what it looks like when someone isn't fully committed to the team, right? Or they aren't fully committed to whatever's going on in the game plan, right? It's the guy who's like off doing their own thing or kind of checked out or makes silly mental errors, right? Or is unwilling to take any risks or push themselves to sort of the limit. And so for me, if you really want to be great at what it is you're doing, if you really want to have a peak performance, you do have to be all in. There's no kind of like, well, if it doesn't work out today, like it's okay, like, yes, of course that's true, right? We've got 82 games. So I'm not asking you to pretend like this is the most important game you've ever played when it's, game 44, but you've got to be just as locked in on game 44 as you do in game 82, right? Otherwise, it's not going to work. And so the example I've thought a lot about since I published the book, unfortunately, I didn't get to write this in there, but is how football teams treat the fourth quarter in North America. And so there's this idea, and this happens in basketball too, right? There's this idea that the fourth quarter is the most important quarter. And it's like, well, why is that? And there's all sorts of psychological biases at play that sort of suggest that this is the most important 12 or 15 minutes that we have. And commitment is the opposite of that, right? It's being fully locked in all 48 minutes that you're out there, not just locking in for the final fourth quarter that everyone thinks is most important, right? And so I talk a little bit about how you sort of push yourself into being fully locked in, fully committed, giving your all, whatever your all is that you have to give. It's essentially effort at that point, right? And being willing to push yourself to that place instead of showing up and being like, well, I don't have 100%, so I'm not going to try that hard today, or we're not running the game plan that I like, so whatever, it doesn't matter, or oh, it's not the fourth quarter yet, so it's cool for me to take some time off. It's like all those things undermine peak performance.
It's amazing what thoughts emerge and dissolve in even the very best players' minds. It really is. It's extraordinary. And as you said, they've got to immerse themselves in their process, in their performance, in order to overcome any of those thoughts that emerge and ignore them and keep executing actions. In principle 3 of part 2, we're back to this word again, adaptation. Talk me through this.
Yeah, so I mean, there's now you're going to start to see, some sort of parallels between part 1 and part 2, right? And I think the reality is there does need to be some sort of overlap or pivot points where typical performance bleeds into peak performance. I think to treat them as completely separate things is sort of a little bit misguided and too siloed, right? We were talking about that offline before we click record, but just some of the different ways that our work sort of manifests. And so principle 3 is kind of like psychological flexibility in the actual moment of peak performance is essentially what this chapter boils down to. So I've talked a lot about what goes into psychological flexibility from long-term performance standpoint and how you stay committed, over the course of 82 games or 14 years or whatever, and stay psychologically flexible and deploy different skills. This chapter is really about, okay, what does that look like in the moment of high performance, right? And so you think about dealing with stress and pressure, for example, right? Like, well, you could ignore that and fight that away, right? You can engage in suppression or avoidance, right? Or you can engage in acceptance, right? And what does it actually look like to accept or be willing to experience the pressure and still try to perform? And so I talk about the concepts of committed action, like showing up in a way that's consistent with your team's values and with your personal values, even when things are uncomfortable. I talk about learning to let go of unhelpful thoughts or distracting thoughts, like we just talked about, in critical moments, so that, again, you can stay fully present and agile, really, in the context of whatever is going on in your performance, right? I mean, as well as I do, no plan survives first contact. So whatever you've prepared for in peak performance, you're going to have to change a little bit of what goes on. You're going to deal with some discomfort. You're going to have to experiment and try something new. And this chapter is about how you get yourself into a mindset that allows you to do that without getting too hung up on all the preparation or training you did, or too caught up in how it should be, and is really about being, again, present, open to what's going on, engaged in your values, and committed to the performance at hand, and giving yourself the freedom to perform in the way that is called upon in the actual performance itself, not how it was prescribed before you got out there.
Principle 4, an area I'm just so interested in, and I think we don't make enough of a fuss about this area. I think it can be quite subtle. Energy optimization. Talk me through this with relation to peak performance.
So this concept really came to me pretty early in my career in the NBA. Before I was with the Raptors, I had spent a lot of time working with college athletes, and honestly, this specific situation really hadn't come up much. But when I got to the NBA, one of the things that happened a lot was players came to me to talk about managing their energy getting on and off the bench. And I was like, that is such an interesting thing to navigate. What a unique um, place to try to optimize, right? Like I had never, honestly, I had never thought about it before then, but it was as simple as this idea like, man, if we could get this guy in the game and fully present and ready to perform as quickly as possible after having sat for 30 minutes, what kind of advantage could we have if we just minimize the amount of time it takes for him to get fully into the game, right? And similarly, when someone comes out of the game, if we can speed up the process to recovery, right, so that they're actually taking advantage of the rest time that they have, what kind of advantage would that create for us? um, and we've all seen this, right? You've seen the player who makes a mistake and gets pulled by the coach and then spends the next 10 minutes with a towel over his head, or her head, sort of wallowing, for lack of a better word, right? Like all of that is delaying recovery and ultimately hurting your energy efficiency and ability to perform the next time you go out there, right? And so that was the sort of genesis of this chapter, was like, there's got to be something we can do here about managing the ebbs and flows of your emotion, your energy throughout the course of your performance to really maximize how much you have in the tank at any given moment. And this went from as simple as like, how do we take little breathers when you're actually out there on the court, right? Like, if the play is drawn to the other side of the floor, how do you actually like, check out for a second and check back in so you can get just a little bit more energy? When you come off the bench, how do you get in as quickly as possible? And when you go to the bench, how do you let stuff go that's gone on in the game so you can engage in recovery a bit? And so this chapter is really all about that. It's about finding little moments for recovery. It's about figuring out how you control your physiology so you can wind down or wind up as you need to, right? One of the biggest challenges I found in the NBA was role players coming in. And basically, you have 2 minutes to try to execute whatever your job is. Often it's like shooting big time shots, right? Well, if you spend that first minute like getting warmed up because you haven't played, it's going to be hard to execute, and you're probably not going to play much more than 2 minutes, right? And so I needed to figure out, like, how do I get you ramped up and ready to go as quickly as possible and get you immersed, right? And a big part of that is ramping up your energy. We often think about calming down, but ramping up and getting fully locked in, I think, is just as important. And then, like I said, I talk a little bit about how do you sort of calm yourself down, recenter, and come back, to the bench essentially, and calm down. And so in this context, I introduce simple skills like reframing, for example, where like if you've made a mistake, you can easily reframe it or recategorize it so that it's a little bit less impactful. I talk a little bit about allowing mistakes to be dealt with after the game instead of in the game. I talk a little bit about training your attention to be, here now, again, to sort of pull on that thread of presence throughout. So when you come to the bench, for example, you're not still dwelling on a past mistake, you're fully engaged in your recovery. And then I talk a little bit about other ways that you can, if you're a corporate performer, do some things to help manage your energy. If you're, say, like too jacked up, I talk about, engaging in exercise, for example, to help manage your energy. Or breath work so you can calm down before the big pitch. So I try to introduce some other skills here outside of sport that could be helpful too.
A final principle, principle 5, it's a word we've used a few times already today: resilience. Close things out for us here, Alex, by taking us through resilience, and then maybe after just give us some final thoughts for some takeaways from the book.
Sure. Well, Dan, thank you for walking me through this too. It's been a lot of fun. So, I mean, again, we've got the kind of overlap, right, between typical performance and peak performance, but this was one I didn't feel like I could let out. And we've already referenced this, right? But the reality is, you're going to make mistakes in the game, right? You're going to make mistakes in the pitch. You're going to make mistakes when you're parenting. Like, all these things are going to be kind of part of what goes on for you. And so fundamentally, you've got to be able to let that go as quickly as possible and return to the game, learn from it, and then be able to get back into whatever performance is going on. And for me, this idea, again, to reference what happened in my time in Toronto, was sort of born out of one of the research questions I asked when I was with the Raptors. I was essentially trying to figure out, is there a material difference in how quickly some players respond to mistakes, right? With the idea being that, like, if you execute something poorly, you make a mistake, and it hurts the team's performance, how long before you do something that positively contributes to the team's impact again? Because again, I'm thinking about small places of competitive advantage, right? If we can get you to go from, say, 20 seconds off wallowing in your mistake to 10 seconds off wallowing in your mistake to 5 seconds, that'd be pretty useful if everything's happening in a 24-second shot clock. Like that's a full defensive possession where you might be a little bit more locked in, right? That we just got back in the game. And so ultimately, I think a lot of that boils a little bit down to kind of who you are and the way you think about mistakes and the work you do on the front end to sort of prepare yourself for that and think about contingency planning and all that. And then a little bit boils down to things like as simple as self-talk or challenge appraisals that allow you to sort of see mistakes or setbacks for what they are as an opportunity to learn and grow and get better rather than, some sign that you're not good enough or that you should give up or quit early just because it's not working your way. And so chapter 5, your principle 5 here is really all about the skills you can deploy to help yourself be a bit more resilient after you've had a setback in the game, right? And so I think about resilience both over the long term, like how do you stick with something even when you do have major setbacks? If I think about major life events, right? The passing of a family member or something like that. Like these are all adversities you have to navigate that will impact, say, the games that you play, but probably impact you for months on end too. And that requires a bit of resilience. And then you're going to have much smaller setbacks in the context of performance, like missing a shot or making a turnover that you're going to have to be resilient and respond to. And so I guess to close you out here, Dan, first, thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about this. It's been a lot of fun.
More than welcome.
And second, I wrote this book ultimately to help as many people as I could become the best version of themselves. And as you know from reading a million sports psychology books like me, there's so many things that you can do. Like there's a lot of places to get started. There are a lot of things that you may read in here or hear in here that you're like, man, I could get a little bit better at that, or that really resonated for me. And so I guess being the behaviorist that I am, I'll leave with one final word, which is to just pick something. Pick one of these qualities or one of these skills that you want to get better at and stay focused on working on that for a bit of time. This book is designed to be used like that, where you're working on one thing at a time and really trying to get better at that specific area before you move on to the next thing, rather than trying to work at all 10 things at one time. And I'm confident that whichever you pick, there's no right or wrong. So wherever you pick to start is going to be helpful for you. And that if you work on it diligently enough with what you've learned in here, you will actually become better at what you do.
I love it. And great advice at the end there. Alex, thank you so much for this. Absolutely awesome. I really enjoyed reading the book. Fantastically laid out and covers the complexity and the nuance and the challenges of ambitious competitors and people who are ambitious in the workplace as well. So fantastic. How can people find you, follow you, get in contact, and more importantly, or as importantly, I should say, find your book?
I'll answer the last question first because it's easiest. So the last question, you can find the book anywhere books are sold. Amazon is the easiest one.
Sure.
I think we're on all Amazons internationally, which is cool. And then finding and following me, I'm on the internet at Alex Auerbach PhD. So you can find me on X at Alex Auerbach PhD, LinkedIn at Alex Auerbach PhD, at my website www.alexauerbach.com.
Alex, thank you so much for today.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think, so please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.